Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. She thought her success made her untouchable. Her friends' silence. Just envy, she assumed. But when life flipped the script and stripped her of everything, the same friend she mocked became the one person she needed the most. This isn't just a story about friendship. It's a powerful tale of jealousy, betrayal, pride, and the brutal lessons life teaches when we least expect it. How far can someone fall before realizing what truly matters? And when roles are reversed, will forgiveness even be possible? Stick around, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Hit that subscribe button now if you're ready to witness a story that's as real as it is unforgettable. Emily sat cross-legged on the edge of her twin-sized bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her tiny studio apartment, where dreams pressed against drywall and survival echoed through every pipe. Her phone buzzed with another, maybe next time email, and the rejection settled in her chest like a stone in still water, rippling through the last of her hope. Across the city, Samantha was posing for magazine covers, sipping champagne with fashion editors, and throwing words like authenticity and grind into interviews like she'd invented them. But Emily remembered the nights they stayed up, mapping dreams under fairy lights in Samantha's dorm room, scribbling ideas for a joint YouTube channel, and promising not to leave each other behind. Those promises dissolved the day Samantha got her first brand deal and conveniently forgot to tag her co-creator, leaving Emily to explain to their tiny audience why the channel had suddenly become a solo act. The betrayal hadn't come with fireworks or tears. It had arrived quietly, like dust collecting in corners, until it was too thick to ignore. And now, alone and uninvited to the Women in Media Awards, Emily felt the bitterness settle deeper than disappointment. It felt like erasure. The rain outside tapped on the window like a soft knock from the universe. But Emily wasn't in the mood for poetry. She was in survival mode again. Her fridge held 2 eggs, expired yogurt, and a half-empty bottle of hot sauce. But her heart was heavier than her stomach, and hunger didn't matter as much as the ache of being forgotten. She opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen of her editing software, trying to summon the courage to post her new video, a raw story about betrayal but told through metaphors and careful lighting to keep names unspoken. Meanwhile, Samantha's new post was trending, a glossy PR video about lifting other women, filmed on a yacht in Italy, captioned with a quote Emily once whispered to her on their dorm balcony. It was like watching her soul get packaged and sold by someone who had long stopped seeing her as real. Emily sighed, hit upload and whispered to herself, "If I stay quiet now, I'll disappear forever." She didn't want revenge. She wanted to be heard, to be seen, to matter. Far across town, Samantha laughed at something her manager said, not because it was funny, but because it was expected, part of the brand, part of the performance. She hadn't thought about Emily in months, not really, though she occasionally scrolled past her posts with a flicker of discomfort. She quickly buried beneath business calls and brunches, in her world of curated friendships and click-worthy activism. Authenticity had become another costume, and somewhere in the process of becoming someone, she had forgotten who she used to be. She'd always told herself it wasn't betrayal, it was business, timing, strategy. But deep down, in the quiet moments between events, she wondered if Emily still thought about her. When her assistant handed her a tablet with the latest trending video, Samantha's smile faded. It was Emily's face, raw and trembling, speaking to the camera about lost friendships, stolen words, and the ache of being overlooked. No names were mentioned, but the message was clear, and for the first time in a long time, Samantha felt something that glitter couldn't mask: shame. Emily didn't sleep that night. Her video had begun to spread faster than any of her others, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, painfully, beautifully, audaciously true. Messages poured in from girls who had also been left behind, their voices forming a digital choir of solidarity that wrapped around her like a blanket. She didn't feel famous or vindicated. She felt seen, and that was enough, for now. She paced the floor of her apartment, counting the steps like prayers, wondering what Samantha would think, if she would respond, if she would finally say something. But nothing came. Not a message, not a call. Just silence. The same silence that had followed every brand Samantha launched without her, every panel she wasn't invited to, every DM she sent that was left unseen. And yet, Emily didn't regret it. Her truth was out there now, floating in the world like a signal flare. If nothing else, she had reminded herself that her voice mattered, even if the person she once called a sister chose not to hear it. Samantha sat alone in her penthouse, the skyline glittering like a promise she no longer believed in, watching Emily's video again, with her arms folded tightly across her chest. The words weren't accusatory, they were gentle, almost tender, as if Emily still cared enough to be soft. That's what made it worse. If Emily had screamed or raged, Samantha could have dismissed it as jealousy. But this vulnerability, it disarmed her. She remembered the night they cried over burnt noodles in their first apartment, swearing that success would never change them. She remembered the time Emily stayed up all night, editing a video for Samantha's class project, even when she was sick. And now, all she could remember was how easy it had been to ghost her, how quick she was to prioritize a brand deal over a bond, and how small Emily's name had looked when she quietly deleted it from their joint bio. For the first time in her career, Samantha felt the weight of a follower count that couldn't console her. The days that followed were filled with echoes. Emily's video was shared on podcasts, featured on blogs, and stitched into TikToks by girls who had never met her, but knew exactly how she felt. Samantha too felt the ripples, not as backlash, but as a slow erosion of the story she'd told herself for years. She tried to keep up appearances, kept posting polished photos and brand slogans, but the comments had changed. People were asking about Emily, not accusing, just noticing. And that subtle shift in narrative was more powerful than any call-out. Emily, on the other hand, was offered a panel spot on a podcast about authenticity and healing, and though she hesitated, she said yes, not to clap back, but to keep speaking her truth. Her voice was still shaky, but it was steady enough to carry meaning, and that was all she needed. As the world slowly turned its head toward her, Emily didn't stand taller out of pride, but out of resilience, because surviving invisibility had made her radiant. Late one evening, as rain painted the windows with silver streaks, Emily received a message request from an unverified account. It was, "Samantha, just a single sentence. I saw your video. I'm sorry." No punctuation, no excuses, just silence. And then that sentence. Emily stared at it for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure whether to respond or delete it. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive, or even if forgiveness was the right word. What Samantha had taken wasn't just credit. It was trust and rebuilding that would take more than an apology typed from comfort. Still, something inside her softened, not because Samantha deserved grace, but because Emily deserved peace. She powered off her phone and placed its screen down on the table. Tonight wasn't for her to decide. Tonight was for breathing, for being. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be rushed. The following week, Emily was invited to speak at the Women in Media Awards, not as a nominee, but as a surprise guest speaker, invited after her video reached the desk of one of the organizers. She almost declined. Part of her still carried the ache of watching Samantha win that same award 3 years ago, while she clapped from her couch with a bowl of noodles. But she went anyway, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she had something to say to every woman who had been forgotten, dismissed, or replaced. Standing backstage in a borrowed blazer and second-hand heels, Emily inhaled the moment like a promise she had made to her younger self. When she walked onto that stage, the room didn't fall silent because of her fame. It paused because of her presence. And as she began to speak, her voice shook, but her story stood firm, because some stories don't need validation to be powerful. They just need to be told. Samantha watched the live stream from her bedroom, eyes locked on the screen, heart caught in her throat, as Emily spoke with clarity, warmth, and power. It was surreal to see the girl she once abandoned become the woman the world now applauded, not because she changed, but because she refused to. No rebrand, no revenge, just the truth, spoken clearly and courageously. Samantha wanted to look away, but couldn't. Her hands trembled around her coffee cup, and she knew then that the world wasn't punishing her. It was simply recalibrating to recognize the one she had underestimated. She could have chosen to reach out again, to offer more words, more apologies, but something told her this was not her moment. This was Emily's. And maybe the best thing she could do was let it be. To listen, to sit with the discomfort, to learn what it meant to lose someone not to death, but to growth. When the lights dimmed and the applause faded, Emily walked off stage not with swagger, but with serenity. The ghosts of past betrayal no longer haunted her steps. They followed behind, quiet and defeated, unable to cling to the woman she had become. She didn't post about the event. She didn't need to. The moment wasn't for Instagram. It was for the girl who once wept quietly in the mirror, wondering if her voice would ever matter. Now she knew it did. And though Samantha's name remained unspoken in every public speech, it lingered in the subtext of Emily's triumph. Not as a villain, but as a reminder. Some friendships break you, some betrayals wake you, and some silences teach you how to roar. Emily's old YouTube channel, once dormant and barely seen, was suddenly flooded with subscribers, not because she had changed her content, but because the world had finally turned toward her voice. She didn't post glamour or gossip. She shared soft monologues about healing, betrayal, creative burnout, and the hunger to matter. And that hunger, she realized, wasn't shameful, it was sacred. The comment section had become a haven for other women finding their words again. Some even mentioned Samantha, asking if the two would ever reconcile. Emily never responded to those comments, not because she was bitter, but because her healing wasn't dependent on confrontation. Sometimes, silence is a scar you choose not to reopen. At her next event, Samantha stood on stage before an audience of editors and influencers, but the room felt colder, like the applause had lost its rhythm. She delivered her usual speech on branding and empowerment, but midway through she faltered, forgot her next slide, lost her train of thought. She smiled and recovered, but her mind kept drifting. Would Emily have said this? Would she have paused to listen? That night, back at her hotel, she scrolled through Emily's newest video, a quiet walk through the city, talking about identity and disappointment. It was simple, unsponsored, and more compelling than anything Samantha had filmed in years. She shut her laptop and sat in the dark, wondering if some success is just a beautifully lit cage. Emily walked the park trail near her apartment in a hoodie and headphones, letting the city's noise blend with her thoughts. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being unnoticed. She had become intentional about her presence, both online and offline, when a college girl stopped her and said, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." Emily smiled, genuinely, and replied, "We all say it when we're ready." That was the difference now. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to stay real. And in that authenticity, something strange had happened. She was rising, not fast, but strong, and every step she took felt like walking out of someone else's shadow and into her own light. The day of the summit arrived, and Emily stepped into the venue in a simple navy jumpsuit. No glam squad, no entourage, just purpose. The backstage staff welcomed her with warm familiarity, and for a brief moment she saw herself through their eyes, calm, grounded, and real. She closed her eyes as her name was announced, walked onto the stage to quiet applause, and began to speak, not with drama, not with dazzle, but with deliberate honesty. "I used to think success was about being invited into the room," she said. "But now I know it's about what you say once you're inside." There were no roaring cheers, just a stillness that told her they were listening. And for Emily, that stillness was louder than fame. Samantha sat in the second row, hidden behind dark glasses, her legs crossed tightly as she watched Emily command the stage with ease. The words weren't showy, but they hit hard, cracking something she hadn't realized was brittle. The room leaned into Emily, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. For the first time in years, Samantha wasn't the one they were watching, and that silence around her felt like thunder. She clapped politely, but her soul didn't move. Instead, she felt the aching reality of what pride had cost her. Not a stage, not a spotlight, but a sisterhood she had once discarded, like a stepping stone. Emily finished her keynote with a quiet declaration. Never confuse someone's silence with their absence. Some of us are just building deeper roots before we bloom. The audience rose slowly, not with forced applause but with reverence, many of them with tears in their eyes. Backstage, she was swarmed by women wanting to share their stories, thank her, and hug her. Emily stayed as long as she could, soaking in each moment, not because she needed validation, but because connection was her currency now. She didn't even notice that Samantha had slipped out quietly, head bowed, hands clenched around a purse full of things success couldn't fix. Back home that night, Samantha sat in her luxury apartment, surrounded by cold marble and flickering city lights, replaying Emily's words in her mind, like a song she couldn't unhear. There was no scandal, no tabloid headline, no public downfall, just a quiet, humbling realization that life had shifted beneath her, and she hadn't adapted. She used to laugh at Emily's simplicity, call her too sensitive, too emotional, but those very traits had become her superpower. Samantha poured herself a glass of wine and didn't drink it. She just stared at it, remembering the girl who once shared instant noodles with Emily in a cramped studio apartment. That girl, she realized, wouldn't recognize this woman. Emily, meanwhile, walked home in comfortable shoes, earbuds in, voice notes playing from women who had heard her speech and wanted to talk further. She smiled at a child who waved at her from a window, nodded at the security guard who always held the door for her, and stopped by her favorite bodega for tea. The city hadn't changed, but she had. She no longer felt invisible, even in the smallest moments. And that, she realized, was the reward she had chased for years. Not money, not fame, not clout, just to feel like she mattered in the everyday. As Emily sipped her tea by the window, watching the city breathe around her, she felt peace, but not the fragile kind that comes from escape. It was the peace of someone who had faced the mirror and kept going. Across town, Samantha finally opened her journal again, writing, "I used to think I was the story, but maybe I was just the lesson." Neither woman knew what the next chapter held, but fate was still writing. And it hadn't finished with them yet. Emily told her about the nights she cried into her pillow, about the job applications that never got a reply, and how a stranger's kindness kept her from sleeping in her car. Samantha told her about the loneliness of fame, the fake friends who vanished when she needed them most, and the fear of becoming irrelevant before 35. They saw each other again, not as rivals or relics of a ruined friendship, but as women who had grown, suffered, and somehow survived. Their pain had taken different shapes, but it had taught them both the same things: humility, loyalty, and the cost of not saying "I'm sorry" when it mattered. When they finally stood to leave, the rain had stopped, and the streets shimmered like mirrors under the fading evening light. "I don't know where we go from here," Samantha said, honestly, slipping her phone back into her bag without asking for a picture or a favor. "Maybe nowhere," Emily replied, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "Or maybe just somewhere new." They hugged, not long, not dramatic, but just enough to say we're not enemies anymore. As they walked in separate directions, both women felt something lift from their shoulders, like a weight they'd forgotten they were carrying. That night, Emily opened her journal and wrote, "She's not the villain anymore. Maybe she never was. Maybe we were both just lost." And across the city, Samantha finally sent the message she had written 100 times, but never sent. "Thank you for being the kind of friend I didn't deserve, but needed to become better." Neither of them replied, but somehow both knew it was the beginning of something whole again. "I read your article," Samantha blurted, almost too quickly, her cheeks flushing with the admission, the one about loyalty and losing things that mattered. Emily tilted her head slightly, unsure what to say, unsure how much of that confession came from guilt or growth. "Thanks," she said, though her tone was gentle, cautious, like stepping on glass barefoot. Samantha looked down at the book in her hand, and then back up. "It made me cry, and not because it was about you, but because I saw myself in every wrong decision." Emily breathed slowly, surprised by the sincerity in Samantha's eyes, and even more surprised by how much she wanted to believe her. They moved to the small reading table near the front window, 2 coffees between them, and a silence that no longer felt like a wall, but more like a waiting room. "I was jealous of you," Samantha admitted, stirring her drink as though her honesty needed to dissolve into something safer. "Not just of what you became, but of how you did it, without pretending." Emily looked out the rain-speckled glass, blinking back the years they'd lost to pride and misunderstanding. "And I was ashamed," she said softly, "of needing help, of not being who you were back then." The words hung there, naked and healing. They talked for an hour, then 2, sipping slowly as the storm outside turned into a drizzle, the grey sky softening into something warmer. They laughed at old college stories and winced at the moments they'd both misread each other. "I thought you looked down on me," Emily said, voice cracking a little. "I did," Samantha whispered, "but only because I didn't want to look down on myself. It wasn't an excuse, but it was the truth. And that truth began to stitch something broken between them, even if only loosely. The bookstore was quiet on that rainy afternoon, its old wooden floors creaking beneath Emily's boots, as she wandered through the aisles, searching for nothing in particular but grateful for the calm. She was supposed to be meeting her editor at the cafe next door, but a sudden downpour had pushed her inside, her coat dripping slightly as she wiped her hands on a scarf. The smell of old paper and roasted coffee filled her nose, wrapping around her like a memory she hadn't asked for but welcomed anyway. As she rounded the fiction section, her eyes caught a familiar figure standing by the self-help shelf, fingers tracing the spine of a book they once laughed about years ago. Her heart stopped, not from anger, not even from hurt, but from the sheer shock of seeing Samantha again. Samantha hadn't planned on being there either. She ducked into the bookstore to get out of the rain, walking in slowly with no umbrella, and a hood that did little to keep her dry. She hadn't been in a bookstore in months, maybe even a year, but something about the quiet called to her more than any event or red carpet had in a long time. She picked up a copy of a memoir about second chances, flipping through the first few pages absent-mindedly, until she felt the unmistakable presence of someone watching her. She looked up, and there she was, Emily, standing a few feet away, her face unreadable, but her eyes full of stories they hadn't yet told each other. They stood frozen in that moment, strangers shaped by the same past, bound by an invisible thread stretched thin by silence and pride. Emily swallowed first, unsure whether to smile or turn away, but something in Samantha's eyes held her there, caught between memory and meaning. The silence between them was thick, filled with apologies that had never been spoken, and pain that had never been properly buried. Finally, Emily stepped forward and said the first true thing between them in years. "Hey, Sam." It wasn't grand, it wasn't poetic, but it was enough. Enough to open the door. Samantha blinked, lips trembling slightly, as she managed a quiet, "Hey," in return, voice softer than Emily remembered, but more real than it had ever been. The air between them shifted, not cleared, but stirred, like dust that had settled too long on a shelf. They both laughed nervously, the way people do when history meets the present, in a place too small to run from it. "Crazy weather," Samantha said, as if that could explain the universe conspiring to make them face each other here. Now. Emily nodded, and for a moment they stood side by side again. Not friends, not enemies, just two women holding pieces of a shattered bond in their palms. Samantha returned from her trip to find her apartment colder than usual. Not from the weather, but from the silence. No brand boxes waiting by the door, no PR invites in her inbox, no assistants buzzing around her with questions or tasks. The quiet was deafening. She made tea and stared out the window, watching the skyline that once felt like hers now belonged to someone else. She thought of Emily, her laugh, her loyalty, her ugly cry in that coffee shop all those years ago. She thought of how she'd mocked Emily's brokenness instead of mending it. And for the first time in years, Samantha whispered something honest to herself. "I hurt the only real one I had." Emily attended a networking dinner where someone introduced her to a best-selling author who said, "You speak with the kind of soul that can't be taught." Emily smiled, thanked him, but her thoughts wandered briefly to Samantha, wondering if she ever thought about the friendship they once had. She didn't miss the drama or the tension, but she missed the beginning, the laughter, the late-night talks, and silly dreams before everything got tangled in pride. That night, she pulled out an old photo album and found a Polaroid of them from college, smiling in front of a bookstore. She stared at it for a long while, then tucked it back into the drawer without tears. but not without feeling. Samantha began journaling again, a habit she'd abandoned the moment she became too busy being seen. She wrote about Emily, about the silence between them, about how life had flipped their scripts. Her words were messy but real, like her heart, pages of regret, apologies that would never be posted, and prayers she wasn't sure how to say aloud. Writing didn't fix anything, but it opened a door inside her that had been closed for too long. She wasn't ready to reach out, but for the first time, she hoped the chance might come, not to fix the past, but to face it. Emily finished the first draft of her book that night, ending it with a sentence that hadn't been in her outline. Forgiveness is the bridge we build when we're ready to return to ourselves. She didn't know where it came from, but it felt right. Across the city, Samantha fell asleep with her journal on her chest and the faintest hint of peace on her face. Neither of them knew it yet, but fate was already setting the stage for a meeting that would change everything once more. Emily was invited to speak at a charity gala hosted by a foundation supporting women in transition, women who had been homeless, jobless or abandoned, much like she once had been. She arrived early, greeted every staff member by name, and shared a table with 3 women who told her their stories between nervous sips of water. When it was her turn to speak, she told the truth about eating canned soup for dinner, about being ghosted by recruiters, about smiling at people who didn't see her. She didn't try to sound noble, she just sounded human. When she sat down, one of the women whispered, "Thank you for not pretending." And Emily knew then that her voice was finally doing what it was meant to do. Samantha's endorsements started thinning, her publicists suggesting a rebrand that included fake dating rumors and manufactured drama to stay in the spotlight. She turned down the idea, disgusted at how far the game had strayed from authenticity, yet unsure what else to do. She tried pitching a podcast idea to a former sponsor, who replied with a polite, "We're moving in a different direction." That direction, she knew, was away from her. She booked a solo trip to a beach resort to clear her head, but spent most nights lying on crisp white sheets, staring at the ceiling fan, asking herself when everything had started to unravel and why she hadn't noticed sooner. Emily's phone rang late one evening. It was an old professor from her community college days, congratulating her on her recent success and inviting her to mentor a writing workshop for underprivileged students. She agreed immediately, her heart full at the thought of giving back to a space that once saved her. She showed up in jeans and a smile, and the students leaned in close, listening to her like she was magic. But she didn't speak like someone who'd made it. She spoke like someone who still remembered what it was like to be unseen. And in that classroom she realized that her rising star didn't shine by outshining others. It lit the way for those still finding their spark. Samantha sat in a plush conference room surrounded by executives who once hung on her every word, but today their eyes kept drifting toward their phones, barely engaging with her presentation on upcoming trends. She had worn her sharpest suit and curated every slide, yet their reactions were flat, distracted, and oddly disinterested. After the meeting, her manager gave her a polite smile and said, "Good job," before walking away with someone newer, younger, and hungrier. She packed up her things slowly, feeling the sting of irrelevance creeping into her skin like cold air through a cracked window. She didn't cry, not yet, but there was a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. Emily's inbox was full. Emails from agents, podcast invites, speaking engagements, and even a small publishing house asking if she'd consider expanding her keynote into a book. She sat at her kitchen table, in an oversized sweater and socks, sorting through the offers with calm disbelief, occasionally laughing at the irony of it all. These were the same companies that hadn't returned her emails 2 years ago, when she was pitching articles for free. Now they wanted her voice, her story, her words, and they were willing to pay generously. She didn't feel vindictive. She felt grateful, but beneath that gratitude was a quiet whisper. Don't let success make you forget who you are. Samantha scrolled through Instagram and paused on a video clip from the summit, where Emily stood under soft lights, telling a story about loyalty and how betrayal often comes wrapped in expensive packaging. The caption read, "Success isn't about being seen. It's about being remembered for how you made others feel." The comment section was filled with praise, fire emojis, and women calling Emily real, relatable, and revolutionary. Samantha's thumb hovered over the screen, then locked her phone without reacting, feeling a slow, suffocating ache that came not from Emily's glow, but from her own dimming light. She whispered into her empty living room, "When did I stop being someone people rooted for?" Emily's phone buzzed one chilly Wednesday morning with an unexpected invitation to speak at a Creative Women's Summit, sponsored by one of the same companies that had once rejected her. She stared at the email, reading it twice, a curious smirk playing on her lips, not out of bitterness, but from the strange poetry of being called to the table she was once excluded from. The invite was professional, full of glowing compliments, yet she wondered whether they knew who she was or only who she had become in the spotlight. She forwarded the message to her mentor, a retired editor named June, who simply replied, "Go, but don't go small." Emily took a deep breath and accepted, not because she wanted the platform, but because she was finally ready to take up space without apology. Samantha's manager texted her that afternoon with a short message. They booked Emily Scott for the keynote. Thoughts? She froze in the dressing room of her latest campaign shoot, her stylist chatting cheerfully behind her while her mind spiraled. There was no official reason to care. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but something deep inside her trembled with a mix of envy and shame. Emily, keynote. She could feel the shift beneath her designer heels, the subtle rewriting of their story now happening without her. She tapped back a professional noted, "Let's keep an eye on that event." But the tightness in her chest said what her fingers never would. It should have been me. The event was 2 weeks away, and Emily spent her evenings preparing, researching trends, drafting her speech, and practicing in front of her bathroom mirror with the kind of intensity that came from knowing this was more than just a moment. It was a chance to speak to women like her, scrappy, underestimated, misunderstood, who needed more than inspiration. They needed truth. She wasn't dressing up her story. She was pulling out the roots, the regrets, the realities of being left behind. She wanted the women in the room to feel seen, not sold to. On the final rehearsal night, she closed her laptop and whispered to her reflection, "Don't perform, just tell them the truth." Samantha was quietly offered a panel spot at the same summit, and though she smiled in the meeting and agreed, something in her cracked a little when she realized she wasn't the headliner. Her assistant said, "This will still be good for visibility," but Samantha didn't care about visibility. She cared about position. Once the girl with the spotlight, now sharing a panel with influencers half her age, she felt the slip of status like silk sliding off her shoulders. She told herself she was overthinking, but her instincts were too sharp, too seasoned to miss the truth. The industry was shifting, and she was no longer its golden child. Meanwhile, Samantha's team suggested rebranding her image, maybe a documentary, maybe a podcast about friendship. She nodded along, but her chest ached. Friendship? What did she know about that anymore? She had built an empire of connections, but few real relationships. Her inbox was filled with collaborations, but her phone had no one she could call at 2 a.m. to cry with. She missed Emily, not the girl she outpaced, but the friend who once reminded her that humanity was not a liability. And it wasn't guilt that haunted her now. It was longing, but even longing can't undo silence. One night, Emily sat on her rooftop, wrapped in a blanket, watching city lights blink like quiet affirmations. She wasn't rich, she wasn't a household name, but she was at peace. That peace didn't come from likes or applause. It came from knowing she hadn't abandoned herself to get here. In the silence, she thought of Samantha, not with anger, not with sorrow, just with distance. A chapter that had closed, but still rested on the shelf of memory. She whispered to the wind, "I hope she's healing too," and meant it. Forgiveness, she had learned, doesn't always need reunion. Sometimes, it's just letting someone go without dragging their name behind you. In a penthouse across town, Samantha opened her journal, the one she hadn't touched in 2 years, and wrote 5 words. "I miss who I was." She didn't write Emily's name. She didn't need to. Some regrets lived between the lines, soft and unspoken. She knew she couldn't rewrite the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could begin again, not with press releases or photo shoots, but with silence, with stillness, with a choice to remember what kind of woman she had once promised to be. And perhaps, in a city of millions, 2 stories could move forward, separately, quietly, and beautifully undone. The morning after the speech, Emily woke to a quiet sunbeam slicing across her hardwood floor, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a spotlight she didn't earn. Her inbox was overflowing. Speaking invitations, podcast requests, and heartfelt letters from women she had never met, but who had carried the same weight of being erased. Yet, the one message she kept rereading wasn't from a brand or a book agent. It was from a high school girl in Nebraska who said, "I thought I was invisible until I saw you." That sentence stuck to Emily's ribs like nourishment, reminding her that impact wasn't measured by claps in a ballroom, but by echoes in someone else's silence. She replied with a short note, and then closed her laptop, letting the moment be what it was. Not a beginning, not a climax, just a soft, powerful now. Samantha, meanwhile, paced her pristine kitchen, untouched coffee cooling in her hand, haunted by the version of herself that Emily's words had quietly exposed. Her team was in crisis mode, not because of any scandal, but because she could no longer pretend to be the voice for women she had once walked away from. Brands still called, campaigns were still alive, but her name no longer shimmered like it used to. It trembled now subtly under the weight of whispered truths. And worse, her reflection had changed. She caught herself in the window, not as the rising mogul she had crafted, but as the girl who had once promised never to climb without looking back. And yet she had climbed, fast, alone, and with selective memory. At a local cafe with flickering lights and second-hand chairs, Emily sat across from a journalist who had requested a feature for a Rising Voices column. Her voice still carried the slight nervousness of someone who wasn't used to being asked questions rather than doubted. The reporter asked. Emily stirred her tea slowly, then said, "I stopped waiting for someone to validate my version of the story." The sentence wasn't rehearsed. It was the kind that only comes after nights spent staring at ceilings and doubting your own memory. The journalist smiled, scribbled the quote, and told Emily that her story was already inspiring thousands. But Emily didn't need inspiration. She needed to stay grounded. She left with a quiet heart, reminding herself not to chase the noise, but to keep building something solid. Samantha's phone buzzed during her shoot. A makeup artist dabbing concealer beneath tired eyes that didn't sparkle anymore. It was another alert about Emily's feature going viral. She smiled for the camera, but the gesture felt foreign, like she was wearing someone else's face. The photographer complimented her on her glow, and she almost laughed. What glow? What people were seeing was a filtered version of a woman unraveling, a mirror of her own making that now refused to lie. Later she scrolled through the article, heart tightening at every paragraph, where Emily was praised, not for being glamorous, but for being honest. The difference was jarring, and for the first time in years, Samantha wondered if she had traded truth for image, and lost the part of herself that once created from love, not leverage. The morning after their unexpected meeting, Emily sat at her desk with her hands hovering above the keyboard, unsure of whether to write about what had happened, or to keep it sacred and unwritten. There was a heaviness in her chest that felt like a strange mix of peace and pain, as if acknowledging Samantha's humanity had unraveled something inside her too. She looked through old photos on her phone, stopping at one where they had once stood outside a lecture hall, arms linked, faces full of dreams and naivety, unaware of what time would do to them. She hadn't cried yet, not in the bookstore, not on the train ride home. But now, as the quiet of the morning wrapped around her, the tears came uninvited. They weren't angry tears, or sad ones even, just the kind that come when you finally feel safe enough to mourn what you lost. Samantha, meanwhile, sat cross-legged on her living room couch, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, almost hypnotic circles, replaying every word they had shared. Her apartment was still the same, a cold, glamorous loft with tall windows and minimal warmth, a perfect metaphor for the life she had built without Emily in it. She thought of all the interviews where she'd said she had no regrets, and how easily those lies had slipped out of her mouth, practiced and polished. But now, regret sat beside her like a quiet guest who refused to leave, whispering reminders of birthdays missed, messages deleted, apologies delayed. She reached for her phone again, scrolling to Emily's contact, thumb hovering over it, unsure if another message would reopen a wound or build a bridge. In the following days, both women found themselves haunted by memories, some warm and golden, others cold and sharp like glass beneath the skin. Emily would find herself smiling at odd moments, like while stirring her tea or waiting at the crosswalk, thinking of Samantha's terrible impressions and their shared obsession with midnight pancakes. But then the smile would fade, replaced by the sting of betrayal, the sound of those cruel words Samantha once said, echoing like an uninvited chorus. Samantha too remembered everything, how she had laughed with others at Emily's struggle, how her silence had been louder than any insult, how her pride had cost her the one person who truly saw her. They each tried to move on with their days, Emily attending work meetings and preparing her next feature article, Samantha flying out for a fashion shoot in Milan. But something felt out of place, like they had left a chapter unfinished. Emily struggled to concentrate on her writing, every sentence weighed down by thoughts of reconciliation and forgiveness, wondering if people really ever changed or just got better at hiding their selfishness. Samantha posed for cameras and answered press questions with effortless charm, but every night she came home and stared at her reflection, asking herself if success was really worth what it cost. They were both women learning to live with the truth, that healing was not always clean or immediate, but it was necessary. One night, Emily attended a small gathering hosted by her editor, a quiet affair filled with writers, poets, and low jazz music humming in the background. She was halfway through her second glass of wine when someone mentioned Samantha's name, their voice light, amused, unaware of the emotional minefield it triggered. "I heard she's back in town for some charity gala," they said. She's still stunning, but I think the fame is finally wearing her down. Emily smiled politely, nodding along, but something inside her clenched. She didn't defend Samantha, but she didn't mock her either. That silence was her evolution. That same night, across town, Samantha sat alone in her penthouse dining room, the food untouched, the candles flickering softly against the glass windows. She scrolled through photos of the gala she was expected to attend, dresses picked out, shoes aligned, but none of it felt real anymore. The invitations, the applause, the curated perfection, it all felt like an echo of someone she used to be. Someone who once thought power and prestige could replace love and loyalty. She closed her phone and whispered to the empty room, "I miss her." And for once, she didn't try to sound strong. Vulnerability became her quiet confession to the universe. A week passed before they saw each other again, this time at a small coffee shop near the park. Not planned, not dramatic, just fate, gently nudging them into the same space once more. Emily was working on her laptop near the window, and Samantha, in oversized sunglasses and no makeup, stepped in just for a coffee to go. Their eyes met, recognition immediate, but the awkwardness had dulled, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. Emily gestured to the empty chair across from her, and Samantha hesitated for a beat before accepting. There was no dramatic music, no tears, just two women trying again. They talked about books, about rain, about how strange it was that the world kept turning, even when your heart broke silently. Samantha asked about Emily's latest article, genuinely interested, not because it was polite, but because she had started to respect the voice Emily had found. Emily asked about the charities Samantha had been supporting, and Samantha lit up in a way she hadn't in years, not because of the cameras, but because someone finally cared beyond the image. There was still hurt, still history, but the bridge was slowly being rebuilt, plank by plank, word by word. As they stood to leave, Samantha looked at Emily and said, "I've changed, but I know that doesn't erase what I did." Emily paused before replying, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not asking you to erase it. I'm just asking you to mean it." Samantha nodded, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was performing. The past would always be part of their story, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be the ending. They parted ways again, not as strangers, not as best friends, but as two people who had survived each other and themselves. That night, Emily finally finished her new essay, one titled, "When the Mirror Looks Back." It wasn't just about Samantha. It was about forgiveness, about pride, about how sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones who teach us the most. And as she hit publish, miles away, Samantha stood on her balcony, looking up at the stars, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude, not for fame, not for fortune, but for the second chance she never thought she'd get. And somewhere in that vast, sleeping city, two hearts slowly began to mend. A few days later, Samantha found herself walking through a quiet part of town she hadn't visited since her college years, her heels clicking against the pavement like distant echoes of the girl she used to be. She passed familiar cafes, old bookstores, and finally stopped outside a park bench where she and Emily once spent hours talking about life, dreams, and disappointments they hadn't yet known. With a slow breath, she sat down, her designer bag resting on her lap, feeling strangely out of place yet perfectly present. Her phone buzzed with reminders about shoots and meetings, but for once, she silenced it and allowed the moment to breathe. She had always thought healing came with dramatic closure, but now she realized it often began with quiet remembrance. Meanwhile, Emily was back at her office desk, editing her latest piece, but her thoughts drifted often to the memory of Samantha's eyes across the coffee table, softer, humbler, and more human than ever. She kept trying to convince herself that a single conversation couldn't undo years of silence and pain, but part of her heart longed to believe that maybe some cracks could still let the light in. She had always held her pride close, especially after being mocked and cast aside by someone she once trusted. But pride, she was learning, wasn't the same as peace. She minimized her document and opened an old folder on her computer labeled Us, filled with pictures, poems, and audio recordings from their early friendship. For the first time in years, she didn't delete them. Samantha had started writing again in her journal, something she hadn't done since fame swallowed her voice and replaced it with polished PR statements. She wrote about guilt, not in a self-pitying way, but as a reflection of what happens when people forget that success isn't a shield from consequence. She remembered a time when she had nothing but hope, and a loyal friend who cheered her on through every failed audition and every late rent night. But when she made it, instead of lifting Emily with her, she used her as a measuring stick to feel superior. She had cloaked her jealousy in pride, her insecurity in arrogance, and it had cost her the most selfless relationship she ever had. Emily, too, was reckoning with herself, not for how she was treated, but for how long she had held on to the anger, letting it mold her identity. She had written stories that resonated with thousands, helping people find their way, yet deep inside, she had harbored a wound that never closed. Forgiveness wasn't just about setting Samantha free. It was about releasing herself from the emotional prison that had kept her guarded. The realization hit her on a rainy Tuesday night, when she reread an old message from Samantha, one she never replied to, filled with remorse and honesty that she had ignored out of stubbornness. Maybe pride was a poor substitute for connection, after all. The next weekend, Samantha invited Emily to a small panel discussion on women and resilience, not as an olive branch, but as a gesture of genuine inclusion. Emily was hesitant at first, afraid of being used, tokenized, or paraded, but something in Samantha's tone told her this was different. She accepted the invitation quietly, with no promises beyond her attendance, and when she arrived, she was met with respectful nods and warm glances, not as Samantha's old friend, but as a force in her own right. Sitting beside Samantha on the stage, under soft lights and a modest audience, Emily shared her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had climbed back up after being dismissed, underestimated, and betrayed. Samantha listened intently, even when it hurt, even when Emily mentioned the shame and loneliness that came with being abandoned by someone she once loved, like a sister. It wasn't a public airing of dirty laundry. It was a testament to truth, vulnerability, and the silent cost of ambition. Without empathy, the audience applauded, moved by the authenticity of both women, one who rose from heartbreak and one who had learned that success without character is an empty throne. After the event, they sat side by side in the green room, drinking herbal tea in silence, before Samantha turned to her and whispered, "Thank you for showing up and for not holding back." Emily looked at her, steady and calm, and replied, "You gave me a reason not to." They started meeting more frequently, not out of obligation or nostalgia, but because something tender had taken root again. It wasn't quite friendship, not yet, but it was trust in seed form, watered by honesty and mutual accountability. They talked about real things, their fears, the way loneliness sneaks in, even when surrounded by people, and how fame or success could never replace human connection. Emily shared how hard it had been to build her life alone, and Samantha admitted that being adored by strangers often made her feel lonelier than ever. In their new conversations, there were no performance masks, no status games, just two souls rediscovering the power of shared truth. One evening, Samantha brought out a gift she had been keeping for years, a photo frame with their college graduation picture, wrapped in silk, unopened since the day she bought it. She handed it to Emily with trembling hands and eyes that glistened with something close to redemption. Emily unwrapped it slowly, her fingers brushing over their frozen smiles and eyes full of dreams they once held together. She didn't cry this time. She just smiled, bittersweet and full of warmth, before saying, "Maybe this doesn't belong on a shelf anymore." Samantha nodded, and together they placed the frame on Emily's writing desk, beside her awards and articles, right where the roots of her story began. They weren't pretending that everything was fine, or that history hadn't happened. They were simply acknowledging that people could grow, and that broken things, when cared for, could become even more beautiful. Samantha offered to support one of Emily's community writing programs, not for PR, not for attention, but as a way of showing up in real, tangible ways. Emily agreed, not because she needed help, but because she was learning to accept support without suspicion. And slowly, life began to feel lighter again, not perfect, but purposeful, not seamless, but sincere. The weight of jealousy, pride, and regret was slowly being replaced by gratitude, loyalty, and new beginnings. As they walked through the city one breezy Sunday morning, coffee in hand and no rush in their step, Emily looked up at the sky and said, "Funny how life brings people back when you least expect it." Samantha smiled, her heart still aching with all the unspoken apologies and the courage it took to rebuild. "Maybe it's not about who we were," she replied, "but who we're still becoming." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by strangers, city sounds and sunlight filtering through the trees, the past loosened its grip, and the future, for the first time in a long while, felt wide open and forgiving. The collaboration between Samantha and Emily began modestly, with quiet planning sessions over chamomile tea, and notepads scribbled with ideas and crossed out fears. Emily was hesitant to let Samantha fund her community writing workshops, unsure if it would become another headline or a favor with strings attached. But Samantha insisted on staying in the background, offering resources without ego. It was the first time in years that they worked toward something together, not for the camera, not for validation, but for something larger than both of them. Still, under Emily's calm nods and quiet gratitude, a part of her remained alert, watching for signs that history might repeat itself. She didn't want to be blindsided by misplaced trust again, even if part of her longed to believe things were different now. Samantha noticed the guarded tone in Emily's voice sometimes, especially when money was mentioned or public recognition threatened to overshadow the work. She didn't take it personally. In fact, she respected it, realizing that rebuilding a broken bridge takes more than sincerity. It takes patience, humility, and a willingness to keep showing up, even when the scars still sting. They met every Saturday at the same quiet cafe near the park where they first started dreaming all those years ago. And slowly, Emily began to let her walls down, inch by inch, trust seeping through the cracks like warm light after a long winter. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And Samantha learned to value the slow, steady work of earning back what she once so easily discarded. One afternoon, a journalist caught wind of their reunion and pitched a glossy feature titled "From Envy to Empowerment," the story of two friends rebuilding. Samantha hesitated to respond, knowing how tempting it would be to control the narrative, to turn vulnerability into a polished redemption arc. But she called Emily first. "We don't have to say yes," she said, her voice softer than it used to be, more aware of the weight her choices carried. Emily paused for a long moment before answering. "Let's tell the truth, not for applause, but for someone out there who needs to hear that healing is possible." And so they sat down together, side by side, and told a story not of perfection, but of process, not of heroes and villains, but of women trying. The article sparked conversations online. Some applauded their maturity, others dissected their past like gossip fodder, and a few skeptics accused Samantha of orchestrating it all for image repair. Emily felt the old anger rise again, that gnawing sense of being a pawn in someone else's rebrand. But Samantha responded to the backlash with quiet integrity. She posted a single sentence on her profile: "Real change isn't loud, it's consistent." And then she didn't say another word, choosing instead to let her actions speak louder than speculation. That moment reminded Emily of the girl she used to sit up with at 2 a.m., dreaming not of fame or headlines, but of creating something honest and meaningful. And for the first time she believed that girl might still be in there somewhere. They began hosting monthly workshops for young writers, many of them girls from struggling backgrounds, unsure if their stories were worth telling, unsure if they were worthy of being heard. Emily led the creative sessions with tenderness and clarity, while Samantha helped secure venues, fund supplies, and quietly paid for transportation for the girls who couldn't afford it. Watching Samantha lift others the way she had once refused to lift her brought a strange mix of comfort and sorrow to Emily's chest. Comfort because growth was happening, sorrow because it had taken so much pain to get here. And yet she reminded herself, some lessons only bloom through heartbreak, and the best redemption arcs aren't about words, they're about who you choose to become next. One evening, after a particularly emotional session with a girl who confessed she was close to dropping out of school due to homelessness, Samantha and Emily sat in silence on the steps of the community center. "Do you ever wish we had gotten it right the first time?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper, eyes glistening with regret and resolve. Emily thought about it, about what might have been if there had been no shame, no betrayal, no fall, but she shook her head gently. "No," she said, "because maybe we had to break to understand what real friendship is made of." And in that moment, the air between them wasn't filled with past tension or present hesitation. It was simply still, honest, and sacred. Despite the healing, cracks still showed in small ways, like when Samantha would over-apologize for things not her fault, or when Emily hesitated before opening up, fearing that her vulnerability might one day be weaponized again. But rather than ignore those moments, they acknowledged them, talked through them, and gave each other space to feel without judgment. They had learned that trust wasn't a light switch you flipped. It was a seed you watered daily, even when it looked like nothing was growing. Some days were harder than others, especially when people from their past reappeared with judgments or jealousy. But they stayed anchored in something deeper than approval. They were learning to honor the truth they'd fought for, even when the world wasn't watching. Emily began writing a new book, a memoir titled Burn Marks and Blooming Things, chronicling the quiet traumas and loud triumphs of friendship, pride, shame, and grace. Samantha was the first to read the draft, not to edit or comment, but simply to listen. She wept quietly through the pages, recognizing herself not only in the antagonist moments, but in the redemption arcs too, the places where she had been brave enough to come back, not perfect, but present. She didn't ask Emily to change a single word, because the story was real, and healing had no room for censorship. "You told it beautifully," she whispered, "even when it hurt." And Emily replied, It's beautiful because it hurt, and we lived. When the book launched, Samantha chose not to stand beside Emily on stage, but to sit quietly in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else, her eyes never leaving the woman who had once been her mirror, her rival, her casualty, and now, possibly, her truest ally. Emily thanked her during the speech, not for what she had done, but for who she had become, and the applause that followed wasn't just for the book. It was for survival, for reconciliation, for the kind of love that takes courage to rebuild. And though they didn't hug on stage, their eyes locked in a way that said more than any embrace could. We made it back. Not the same, but better. Later that night, as they sat under fairy lights in a garden restaurant, celebrating with a few close friends, Samantha lifted her glass and said, "To broken things made whole again." Not because we ignored the damage, but because we honored it. Emily raised hers, smiling. And to the people who show up, even after they failed you, especially then, they clinked their glasses, and for a long, quiet moment, the world felt soft again. Not perfect, not painless, but real, and that, they both knew now, was more than enough. Years passed, and the world changed again. Trends shifted, algorithms evolved, and new voices took center stage. Emily and Samantha watched quietly from the sidelines, no longer needing to fight for attention, but cheering for the next generation of storytellers. They hosted retreats instead of panels, created writing sanctuaries instead of viral moments, and left their mark not in headlines but in hearts. Their names may have faded from Google alerts, but they lived on in journals, classrooms, and whispered conversations between mothers and daughters. They had become elders, not in age, but in soul, and they wore that mantle with peace. One day, Emily found a first edition of their book in a used bookstore, dog-eared, and filled with margin notes from a stranger. She bought it, tears in her eyes, and gave it to Samantha with a note inside. Proof we were here, proof we mattered. Samantha smiled, holding the book to her chest, feeling its weight not just as paper and ink, but as legacy. They had turned shame into shelter, jealousy into justice, and heartbreak into healing. And in doing so, they had rewritten what it meant to be women in a world that too often pit them against each other. As the sun set behind Emily's garden that evening, they sat in silence on the porch, sipping tea, surrounded by laughter from the young women they had mentored, who now visited like family. Samantha whispered, "We were once enemies in disguise." Emily nodded and replied, "And now we're sisters in truth." No applause followed, no headlines chronicled their quiet triumph, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. They had learned that true success is not found in being envied, but in being at peace. And as the stars blinked above them, they knew they had not only survived, they had built something sacred from the ruins. One evening, Samantha received an email from her estranged father, brief, awkward, and filled with typos, but at the bottom it read, "I saw your video. I'm sorry I wasn't around when it mattered. You made something out of nothing, and I'm proud, even if I don't know how to say it right." She stared at the screen for a long time, tears pooling in her eyes, the resentment inside her unraveling like a knot, finally given room to breathe. She showed it to Emily, who hugged her without a word, understanding the bittersweet ache of a wound finally addressed. That night, they stayed up late writing letters they'd never send. Samantha to her younger self, Emily to the friendships she once lost. Both of them exhaling grief they hadn't realized still lived inside them. And in that quiet catharsis, they discovered a deeper truth. Healing wasn't linear, but it was possible. Their next project wasn't a book or a campaign. It was a mentorship program called Grounded Grace, where they paired young women with mentors who had lived through storms and come out wiser, not bitter. They raised money quietly, built a small team, and launched with just 20 girls and 20 mentors. The magic wasn't in the scale, but the sincerity. Women meeting in parks, cafes and Zoom calls, exchanging stories not to impress, but to connect. Samantha designed the curriculum around conversations she wished she'd had in her 20s, while Emily crafted the writing prompts that encouraged self-reflection without shame. Within months, stories began pouring in. One girl left an abusive boyfriend, another enrolled in college for the first time, and one finally forgave her mother after years of silence. The impact wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. At a local university, they were invited to deliver a joint commencement address. And as they stood on stage in front of hundreds of graduates, they didn't read from a script. Instead, Emily said, "This isn't a speech, it's a confession. We nearly lost each other to pride, to jealousy, to silence. But sometimes, losing something precious is the very thing that teaches you how to fight for it better the next time." Samantha followed with, "Success isn't about who shines brightest. It's about who remembers to turn around and light someone else's candle." The crowd was quiet at first, and then the applause rose, not the performative kind, but the kind that comes from people who feel seen. Afterward, students lined up, not to take selfies, but to say thank you, to cry, to ask for book recommendations, and to tell them, "I want to heal like you did." One afternoon, Samantha visited her old neighborhood and found the small corner cafe where she and Emily had their first big fight. It was still there, same chipped tables, same burnt coffee, but this time she wasn't broke, angry, or lost. She ordered a tea, sat by the window, and wrote a note to herself. "You didn't just survive, you transformed." Emily joined her later, and together they revisited places they once avoided. Park benches where secrets were whispered, sidewalks where tears had fallen, and even the apartment Samantha once couldn't afford. Instead of shame, they felt reverence. Instead of regret, gratitude. They had rewritten their geography, and now every street held a memory not of failure, but of rising. Emily and Samantha's joint book, Bitter Roots, Blooming Ground, was released with little fanfare. No billboards, no viral countdowns, just a quiet listing on an indie publisher's website, and a few loyal readers who had followed their journey. Yet somehow, within weeks, it began to spread. One copy handed from sister to sister, mother to daughter, woman to woman, as if the pages whispered truths that people didn't even know they needed to hear. Reviews began trickling in, describing the book as a mirror, a healing salve, and a permission slip to be broken, and still worthy. The women who had once fought over applause now found themselves content with silence, filled by purpose, and the validation that had once felt like oxygen now felt like perfume, pleasant but not necessary to breathe. Instead of chasing stages, they began accepting invitations from shelters, youth centers, and small community libraries where hearts were more open than wallets. One rainy afternoon, they stood before a small group of teenage girls in a shelter on the edge of the city, some with tear-streaked faces, and others with hardened stares that dared anyone to try and fix them. Samantha looked at them and saw pieces of herself, angry, guarded, ashamed, and something inside her softened as she stepped forward, no longer needing to perform strength, but willing to offer her scars as proof of survival. She spoke about the nights she cried over missed rent, about stealing confidence from social media filters, about the sting of being looked down on by someone you love. Emily followed with stories of being overlooked, about walking into rooms where no one clapped, about the loneliness of success when your heart hasn't caught up. Together they watched the girls begin to exhale, the kind of exhale that said, "Finally someone sees me," without flinching. As the weeks passed, more girls began writing back. Letters scribbled on notebook paper, voice notes sent through their phones, handmade cards filled with shaky handwriting and fierce honesty. One note read, "I never knew grown women still healed too," while another said, "If you too could make it through everything and still believe in people, maybe I can too." Samantha kept the notes in a shoebox beneath her bed, not for ego but as reminders that her most broken chapters were now someone else's roadmap. Emily began incorporating the letters into her talks, reading snippets with permission, showing the world that healing wasn't a brand. It was a cycle, meant to be passed down and shared. And each time they doubted their direction, they returned to those letters like scripture, proof that their pain had been repurposed into power. Samantha went quiet, not out of guilt, but exhaustion. She had worked so hard to become someone better, and still, the past followed like a shadow that refused to dissolve. She avoided events, turned down interviews, and even considered stepping back entirely from the project, not wanting to taint Emily's trajectory any further. Emily, heartbroken by her silence, showed up at her door one rainy evening, soaked and trembling with frustration. "You don't get to disappear," she said. "Not again. Not when we built this together." Samantha replied softly, "Maybe the world only has room for one of us." And that night, they cried. Not the quiet kind, but the raw, aching sobs of two people trying to hold space for both the pain and the possibility of staying. Eventually, the controversy faded, replaced by new scandals and newer hashtags, but the sting lingered. The campaign rebounded slowly, their bond strengthened, not by applause but by adversity. Samantha returned to the workshops, still camera-shy but more rooted, more aware that her legacy wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the girls who now wrote poems that echoed her resilience. Emily kept writing, now more intentional with her voice, more careful about which platforms she trusted with her story. Together they had learned the truth about fame. It's fleeting, fickle, and often undeserved. But the impact you leave in quiet rooms, those are the seeds that last. They no longer needed everyone to believe in their friendship. They just needed each other too. They took a break from public work for a season, choosing instead to mentor younger women, those just entering the world of art, advocacy, and entrepreneurship, still naive to the costs of visibility. They hosted private dinners, intimate writing circles, and long, quiet walks in the park where their story had first begun. The silence between them no longer held tension but peace, an understanding that they had weathered storms. Not everyone survives, and they were still standing. Samantha said one evening, "Maybe this was the real work all along. Not the stage, not the deals, but this." Emily nodded, smiling, helping others hold their truth, without losing their souls in the process. And though they were no longer headline names, their influence ran deeper, quieter, and far more sacred. As autumn colored the trees outside Emily's small cottage, they sat by the fireplace rereading the first drafts of her new manuscript, this one co-written with Samantha. It was a book about dual healing, about the ways women hurt each other, love each other, and grow into grace together. It was raw, tender, and unfinished, but it felt like a homecoming. "We should call it Bitter Roots, Blooming Ground," Samantha suggested. And Emily smiled through her tears, because even the ugliest beginnings can grow something beautiful. she whispered. And together they wrote side by side, no longer rivals, no longer walking separate paths, but co-authors of a story too complex for sound bites, and too sacred to ever be shamed again. Later that night, Samantha confronted her, not with anger, but with eyes that had seen too much, and trusted too hard. "Did you say yes?" she asked softly, and Emily shook her head. Not yet. There was a long pause between them, filled with years of history and hard-earned tenderness. "You should," Samantha said, her voice steady but her chest tight. "Don't hold back because of me." But Emily heard what wasn't said. The buried grief of being left behind, the fear of becoming expendable again, the question of whether their bond had an expiration date attached to success. She wanted to promise never to forget her, never to choose fame over friendship. But promises made under pressure often sound more like performances than truth. So instead, she simply replied, "I don't want to do this without you." In the weeks that followed, Emily turned down the solo campaign and pitched a new one that highlighted the power of second chances and featured both her and Samantha as co-creators. The company hesitated, fearing Samantha's past controversies might dilute the message, but Emily held firm, saying, "If redemption is only allowed for the marketable, it's not real." They eventually agreed, swayed by her passion and clarity, and for a while, things felt aligned again. The campaign launched with modest success, but not the viral storm they'd hoped for, and quietly, Emily began to wonder if her loyalty had come at a cost. She didn't regret choosing Samantha, but the whispers of what if began to flicker in quiet corners of her mind. Meanwhile, Samantha carried the weight of being included out of kindness, not necessity. And though she was grateful, the feeling of being someone's second choice was hard to shake. Then came the twist they didn't expect. An anonymous blog post titled "The Real Story Behind the Redemption Girls," accusing Samantha of manipulating her way back into relevance through Emily's rising fame. The article cited unnamed sources, hinted at old scandals, and painted Samantha as a calculated opportunist, reigniting doubts in those who barely knew her truth. The story spread like wildfire, trending on social media, and soon both women were inundated with calls, emails, and questions laced with suspicion. Emily was furious, not just at the lies, but at how quickly the world believed them again, as if people were always waiting for a woman to fall. She tried to defend Samantha publicly, posting a video saying, "This is not just my friend. This is someone who's fought her demons and stayed when it was easier to run." But the internet's appetite for drama was louder than its taste for truth. In the months following Emily's book release, opportunities began to pour in. Interviews, TEDx talks, and even a quiet email from a major publishing house offering her a 2-book deal based on the raw vulnerability of her storytelling. Samantha watched her friend rise with a mixture of pride and something else, something quieter, darker, and harder to name. An ache that whispered, "That could have been me." Though she had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, staying humble and supportive, the spotlight now shined almost exclusively on Emily, and the familiar sting of obscurity began to needle her ego. She tried to ignore it, tried to remind herself that this was what redemption looked like, lifting others without needing a pedestal of her own. But some wounds don't fully heal without acknowledgement, and on days when the applause felt distant and the silence deafening, she questioned whether her humility was genuine or just another mask she had learned to wear. Emily, too, felt the shift, not in Samantha's words, but in her energy, the slightly forced smile during book signings, the lingering pauses in conversation, the unspoken tension creeping back into their carefully mended bond. She wanted to ask outright, "Are you okay with this?" but feared it would open a door. Neither of them was ready to walk through. Instead, she invited Samantha to co-host a segment on a podcast, hoping shared purpose would realign their rhythm. But even that felt strained, as if Samantha was waiting for validation instead of simply speaking from her heart. Emily understood too well how invisible one could feel after being center stage for so long. But she also knew that being needed and being noticed weren't the same thing. She wanted to reassure Samantha that her worth wasn't fading, but she also feared doing so would sound patronizing. One evening, at a media mixer, a well-known influencer approached Emily with a smile and a proposition. A new campaign focused on women's resilience, featuring only her, branding her as the voice of recovery. Emily glanced at Samantha across the room, sipping wine and watching her from a distance, and something inside her hesitated. She asked the influencer, "What about my friend Samantha?" only to hear the reply, "She's not the face people relate to right now." "You are." Emily nodded politely, but inside, something cracked. She remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be labeled not enough. And though her dream was finally unfolding, it now came with decisions that felt like echoes of past betrayals. She had once been erased from a stage. Now she was being asked to erase someone else, and the choice sat heavy on her soul. Just when life seemed peaceful and the ghosts of the past had quieted, a new opportunity surfaced, one that glimmered with all the seductive allure of fame and validation they had once craved, but now claimed to have outgrown. A global talk show reached out, offering Samantha a solo appearance to discuss her journey from poverty to purpose, pitching it as a rags to riches spotlight meant to inspire millions. At first, Samantha felt honored, grateful even, until she noticed that Emily's name was conspicuously absent from the invitation, despite the fact that they had co-authored every page and built every program together. The producer casually mentioned, "You're the more compelling figure, the struggle, the grit. It's your face that sells the story." And while the compliment felt good in the moment, it left a strange, bitter aftertaste. She said she'd think about it, her heart torn between the ghost of the girl who wanted to be chosen and the woman who had promised to never step on another to rise. When Samantha told Emily, her words were careful but loaded, her tone light but defensive, as though she anticipated guilt and was bracing for it before Emily could even respond. Emily, to her credit, smiled and nodded, saying, "That's huge, Sam. You deserve it." But there was a flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes, a silent wound poked gently by the world's tendency to spotlight one and shadow the other. That night, Emily stared at the ceiling, replaying their past. Every moment she stood in Samantha's corner, every time she'd been overlooked, and how she'd swallowed it for the sake of peace. She hated herself for feeling bitter, for envying someone she loved, for hearing that old voice whisper, "You're not enough without the struggle." Meanwhile, Samantha stayed up too, rehearsing answers for the interview, wondering if she was betraying something sacred by doing it alone. The day of the interview arrived with nervous makeup artists, coffee in paper cups, and a glittering green room that smelled like ambition and nerves. Samantha sat on the plush couch, mic clipped to her dress, heart thudding beneath borrowed confidence as she prepared to tell her story to the world. But when the host leaned in and said, "Tell us how you built this from the ground up," something in Samantha cracked, like a window straining under the pressure of too many lies. She smiled, lips trembling slightly, and replied, "I didn't build it alone. My best friend and I did this together. I was the cracked soil, She was the sun. You can't grow anything without both. There was a pause, a beat of genuine silence from the crew, and the host, caught off guard, nodded slowly and shifted the script. Samantha spoke her truth, not as a hero but as a partner, and when the segment aired, the world felt it. Emily watched from home, tissues in hand, feeling shame for ever having doubted her friend's loyalty and pride swelling in her chest with every honest word Samantha spoke. That night, Samantha showed up at Emily's doorstep with 2 milkshakes and no makeup, asking, "Did I do okay?" And Emily just hugged her, eyes wet, saying, "You did more than okay, you remembered us." They laughed, cried, and ended up on the living room floor watching old clips of themselves from their earlier, messier days, when they didn't have polished phrases or curated lives, just raw hearts and a dream. It reminded them that their real success wasn't the platform or the program or the applause. It was the friendship that survived, the kind of fractures most never recover from. That night, they wrote a promise in Emily's journal. "We will never let the world divide what pain has joined together. Iti." But the temptation didn't end there. Brands came calling. Book deals were offered, and not all of them wanted both voices. Samantha was the media darling, the come-up queen, while Emily was often referred to as the co-founder, as if her pain was footnote-worthy. They had to have hard conversations, awkward and raw, about how they would handle the imbalance that fame inevitably brought. Emily admitted that sometimes she still struggled with being second in a world that only clapped for first, and Samantha confessed that she sometimes feared being forgotten if she didn't keep performing her pain. In those moments, they weren't public figures. They were 2 little girls trying to be seen, trying not to lose each other again in the shadows of recognition. So they built a system. Any opportunity offered to one would be discussed openly, and they would ask themselves, honestly, does this serve us or just stroke one of our egos? The honesty helped, but so did the therapy sessions they began attending together. Not for crisis management, but for maintenance, for accountability, for naming old patterns before they hardened again. Their therapist helped them understand that jealousy wasn't a betrayal. It was a signal, a flashlight showing where their hearts still felt unseen or unloved. They learned to speak up before resentment had time to rot, to apologize without being cornered, and to ask, is this fear talking or truth? Their friendship deepened beyond the public brand, beyond the photos and the projects, becoming something sacred and intentional. It was no longer about being right or wrong, but about being real. The work was daily, exhausting at times, but worth it, because the cost of silence had once been their bond, and they'd paid that price already. It wasn't until the mentorship session on Friday when a teenage girl named Aria asked, "How do you know someone won't hurt you again if they've hurt you before?" that everything broke wide open. Samantha looked at Emily, eyes wide and suddenly glassy, and Emily's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. After a long pause, Samantha answered with trembling honesty, You don't ever know, but forgiveness isn't about trusting that they won't. It's about choosing to trust yourself to handle it, if they do." The room fell silent, but something shifted between the 2 friends, a raw acknowledgement of the present pain, layered gently on top of all the past ones. After the session, Samantha turned to Emily in the car and said, "I didn't say yes to Melissa, because the only way forward for me is with you." Emily exhaled, a single tear slipping down her cheek, and whispered, "That's all I needed to hear." But healing isn't just in words. It's in choices, in action, in drawing firm lines where there were once blurred boundaries and open wounds. Samantha blocked Melissa's number, not out of spite, but out of protection, choosing her peace over her pride, her friendship over the fantasy of solo success. She wrote a long letter to herself, one she never planned to share, confessing that the little girl inside her still sometimes wanted to be the star, the savior, the one who didn't need anyone. But that woman was lonely, and she'd lived that life already. Emily, in turn, allowed herself to grieve the fact that sometimes even healed people still get tempted, still wander, still falter, and that her role wasn't to control Samantha's choices, but to believe in her growth. They began practicing something new in their friendship, preemptive grace, the kind that says, "I trust who you are today, even if I remember who you were yesterday." The incident brought them closer, not because it was easy, but because it was hard, and surviving it required intention, not just affection. They set new rules for their partnership, like regular check-ins where jealousy, fear, and doubt could be named without judgment, creating a friendship that wasn't just emotionally safe, but spiritually grounded. They also started a podcast together, titled The Unpretty Truth, where they shared their mistakes alongside their victories, hoping to model what it meant to grow in public without pretending to be perfect. The first episode was about that phone call from Melissa, and how temptations don't always come from enemies. Sometimes they come from echoes of who you used to be. The episode went viral not because it was polished, but because it was painfully real, and people could see themselves in both women, the one who tempted and the one who forgave. They began receiving letters from other duos, friends, sisters, co-founders who had fallen out, asking if healing like theirs was really possible, and if so, how it began. Samantha replied to one that struck her deeply, saying, "It begins when one person is brave enough to admit they were wrong, and the other is brave enough to believe they've changed." Emily wrote to another, "Rebuilding doesn't look like the old house. It's a new one, with stronger walls and fewer doors for the past to walk through." Their inboxes filled with stories of heartbreak and reconciliation, proof that their pain had become someone else's permission to try again. They didn't offer guarantees, just guidance, sharing what had worked for them, what they'd learned the hard way, and what they were still figuring out. And in doing so, they found purpose not in being role models, but in being road signs pointing others toward grace. They revisited the places that once held bad memories. A cafe where they once argued, a park bench where Samantha had once ignored Emily's tears, and reclaimed those spaces with new conversations, new laughter, new endings. It became a tradition for them, revisiting pain to overwrite it with presence, reminding themselves that they were not prisoners of their past. They even created a workshop called Rewrite the Room, where participants would return to scenes of heartbreak and speak their truth in the place it was silenced. It was hard, emotional work, but it changed people, because it taught them that healing isn't about erasing the memory, but about taking the power back from it. Every time Samantha stood in those places, she whispered, "I'm not that girl anymore." And every time Emily stood beside her, she whispered back, "Neither am I." Eventually, their story was picked up by a documentary filmmaker who was fascinated not just by their success but by their scars. The film, titled More Than One, followed them for a year, capturing the real, the raw, the ugly and the beautiful. And when it premiered at a small festival, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The final scene showed Samantha and Emily walking down the street, not toward a spotlight, but toward each other, laughing, unfiltered, unguarded. The credits rolled over a quote they'd chosen together. "Some friendships survive because they never break. Ours survived because it did." The audience stood in a standing ovation, not for celebrities but for survivors, of comparison, of pride, of shame, of silence. And as the lights came up, Samantha looked at Emily with tears in her eyes and whispered, "We're really doing this, huh?" And Emily smiled. "We already did." And so, the past knocked again, as it always will. But this time, it found the door locked, the windows bolted, and two women inside, too rooted in love to answer. They knew now that loyalty wasn't a chain. It was a choice, that grace wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, that healing wasn't a destination. It was a discipline. And most importantly, they knew that true friendship doesn't just survive storms. It teaches you how to dance in the rain together. When she returned, the reunion was quiet and teary, the two women embracing at the airport like sisters who had survived a separate war and returned home with different scars. They took a long weekend off work, staying at a cabin near the woods, journaling, eating soup, and sitting by the fire without speaking unless the silence invited them. On the third night, Samantha turned to Emily and said, "You went back when you didn't have to. That's what grace is," Emily replied. "And you stayed when it was easier to walk away. That's what love is." Neither said anything else, but their hands found each other on the blanket between them, fingers interlocked, like a vow made not with words but with presence. That night, under a sky blanketed in stars, they both dreamed the same dream of a future, not free of pain but full of peace. Later that month, they were invited to speak at a global women's summit in Paris, a dream they'd written on a vision board years ago, when they could barely afford groceries. On stage, they stood side by side, telling a room full of leaders that their real strength had come, not from being unbreakable, but from letting themselves be broken and loved anyway. Samantha shared her journey with chronic illness and learning to value rest without guilt, while Emily shared her story of forgiveness and rebuilding the bridge she once burned with her father. The crowd rose to their feet, not just because they were inspired, but because they felt seen. And in that moment, the women who had once fallen apart over pride stood together as proof that healing is always possible when love leads. As the applause echoed, they held hands tightly, hearts full and humbled. Their friendship was no longer a comeback story. It had become a compass, guiding others toward wholeness through the mess, not around it. They wrote a book titled Humbled by Grace, filled with journal entries, letters, and reflections on friendship, illness, betrayal, and rebuilding a life with open hands. The book became a bestseller, not for its perfection, but for its rawness, and it was translated into over a dozen languages. Still, they reminded their audience often that healing wasn't linear, that some days they still argued, still cried, still doubted, but they chose each other again every morning. They built community centers in underserved neighborhoods, offering mentorship and wellness programs, naming the first one The Rebuild, where broken girls could become whole women. And through it all, they kept one promise sacred above all others: to always tell the truth, especially when it was hard. And so, when life tested the healed, it did not find them unprepared. It found them soft but steady, open but rooted, scared but brave. Samantha had once shamed a friend for needing too much, and now she had learned to need without shame. Emily had once watched love leave her behind, and now she had learned to trust its return. Together they walked not as a picture of perfection, but as a portrait of redemption, flawed, beautiful, unfiltered, and real. And for every woman who heard their story, something shifted, a door opened, a phone call was made, a forgiveness was spoken. Because in the end, their greatest legacy wasn't their success, it was that they stayed. Years passed like pages turning in a quiet novel, each season softening the memory of pain and polishing the beauty of endurance as Samantha and Emily settled into a life that felt both earned and undeserved. Their mornings began slowly now. Green tea, morning walks, handwritten to-do lists. No longer a race, but a rhythm that honored their bodies and histories. Samantha's condition remained manageable, though it taught her daily to cherish energy like currency and to say no without apology when her body asked for rest. Emily had moved her father closer to a care home near them, visiting weekly and reading him old poetry, until the words began to mean more than the silence between them. Their company thrived, not because of perfection, but because of transparency. Clients didn't come to them for answers. They came for presence, for the feeling of being held in truth. And as they reached their late 30s, neither woman cared much for applause anymore. They just wanted to matter in quiet, steady ways. They launched a mentorship program for young women navigating career crossroads, grief, and identity crises, calling it The Bridge, named after what they almost lost. Samantha mentored a brilliant introvert named Lana, who reminded her of her old self, ambitious, guarded, terrified of needing others, and it broke her heart in the most healing way. Emily became close with a single mum named Jo, who reminded her that survival wasn't the opposite of success, it was the foundation of it. They hosted monthly circles where no one was allowed to pretend they had it all together, and somehow those became the most sacred rooms either woman had ever stood in. They laughed more than they cried now, but when they cried, it wasn't out of despair. It was a release, like rain after drought. And slowly, they realized they weren't just healing themselves anymore. They were becoming a lighthouse for others lost at sea. One afternoon, while going through old boxes for a podcast anniversary episode, Emily found the friendship bracelet Samantha had given her in college, frayed, faded, but intact. The word fearless stitched with shaky hands. She held it like it was glass, tears welling as she whispered, "You never stopped fighting for us." Samantha walked in and froze, her eyes softening when she saw what Emily held, and for a moment neither spoke. They just remembered who they were, who they'd almost become, and who they chose to be instead. Samantha walked over, took the bracelet, and tied it around Emily's wrist, again, with a shaky smile. "You're the fearless one," she said. "You loved me when I couldn't love myself." And in that quiet office filled with memories they cried, not out of pain, but because of how far love had carried them. Legacy. Emily learned isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet girl whispering hope into a phone line at 2 a.m., or a single mom reading a passage aloud before bed, or a stranger in a thrift store finding a forgotten book that feels like home. Sometimes, legacy is in the forgiveness we choose, the pride we swallow, the loyalty we show when it's hardest, and the gratitude we speak even when we're grieving. Samantha didn't change the world. She changed one friend, and that friend changed the world. And in the end, maybe that's how it always works. One scarred hand reaching out to another saying, "I'm still here, and so are you." And so the story ends, not with perfection, but with truth. Not with all the answers, but with the courage to ask the right questions, to choose humility over pride, gratitude over bitterness, and love over shame. Samantha and Emily proved that even broken friendships can become holy ground, that jealousy can be healed, that betrayal can teach us, and that loss can still lead to legacy. She shamed her friend for being broke, until life humbled her, and in that humbling, they both became something better, something braver, something eternal. And if you listen closely, you'll still hear them in the wind, in the whisper of hope, in the silence between breaths, reminding us all friendship, when real, never dies. It becomes legend. Thanks for watching this emotional roller coaster of a story, where pride fell, loyalty rose, and life taught the hardest lessons in the most unexpected ways. If you felt the twist, the heartbreak, or the power of redemption, then you're exactly the kind of viewer we love having here. There's so much more where that came from. Rich, dramatic tales with real-life depth, unforgettable characters, and powerful life lessons wrapped in gripping narratives. Don't miss out on what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to dive into more cinematic stories and deep historical narratives that leave you thinking long after the screen fades to black. The months grew slower, like a film winding down, and winter came with quiet grace, as Samantha's body finally began asking for more rest than wakefulness. Emily moved in without being asked, redecorating the guest room with lavender, soft blues, and books filled with hope. They watched old movies, told the same stories again and again and again, each time laughing, as if for the first time. Emily read Samantha poetry at night, the same way she once read it to her father, and there was something full circle in that, something holy. One night, Samantha said, "Thank you for staying when I was impossible," and Emily replied, "You were never impossible, just unfinished, and now you are whole." That night, the moon stayed longer, as if watching over two women who had rewritten what friendship could mean. The morning Samantha didn't wake up, felt like the world forgot how to breathe. As Emily sat in the stillness, holding her friend's hand long after it had gone cold, whispering, "You did it, you really did it." There were no sirens, no gasps, just peace, the kind that fills a room where someone has loved deeply and left fully. The funeral was small, exactly how Samantha wanted it. No black, only colors, and no eulogy, just shared stories. Emily wore the bracelet again, the same one she'd found in the box years ago, now barely held together, but more precious than gold. And when she spoke, she said, "She didn't just change my life, she saved it. She showed me what it means to be loyal, to be grateful, to rise again and again, even when the world tries to break you." And in the audience, dozens nodded, their lives proof of her legacy. In the months that followed, Emily took time to rest, not to move on but to carry forward, walking slower, speaking softer, trusting that Samantha had left enough light to guide her through the dark. She turned the bridge into a non-profit, opening new chapters in cities they had once dreamed of, mentoring young women who would never meet Samantha, but would feel her in every word, every circle, every act of care. She kept the podcast going, starting each episode with, "This one's for Sam," and the letters poured in, women saying they felt like they knew her, like she had been their friend too. And sometimes, late at night, Emily would sit by the window, looking at the stars and whisper, "I hope I'm making you proud." And in the stillness, she swore she felt a yes in the wind. 10 years later, a young woman named Clara walked into the Bridges New York office, clutching the book Still Here, tears in her eyes, saying, "I found this at a thrift store. I think it saved me." Emily, now older, silver streaks in her hair, simply smiled and replied, "She has that effect on people." Clara became the youngest mentor in the program's history, and on her first day she wore a handmade bracelet that read, "Enough." A word she said changed her life. And as Emily watched her lead, she realized something powerful, that Samantha's life wasn't over. It was echoing, rippling, becoming part of others in ways neither of them could have imagined. And that was the gift. Not the years they had, but the love they gave away. It was a crisp October morning when Samantha felt the first chill of something changing, a whisper in her body she could no longer ignore, a tiredness that sleep could not fix, and a silence that settled deeper than words. She had always been intuitive, the kind of woman who could feel when something was ending, not with fear, but with a sacred kind of acceptance that only those who have walked through fire understand. Emily noticed it too, not in anything Samantha said, but in the way she lingered longer at doorways, hugged tighter, and stared out the window as if memorizing the sky. They didn't talk about it right away. Sometimes love is quiet because it's too big to speak. But one evening, over candles and wine, Samantha finally said, "I think my body is getting tired. Tired in a way that isn't just rest." And Emily, though she already knew, just reached for her hand and said, "Then let me carry the next part with you." The diagnosis wasn't a surprise, but it still hurt, like betrayal, like the world asking too much from someone who had already given everything, as Samantha was told that the illness she had kept at bay was no longer something she could outrun. The doctors were kind, the prognosis gentle but unshakable, a year, maybe more, depending on the winds of grace. Emily sat in the waiting room, fists clenched in prayer, in denial, in rage, and in memory, thinking of all the times she had misunderstood Samantha's silence as distance, not knowing it was fatigue, not coldness. They cried in the car on the way home, the kind of sobs that shake the soul, not because they were afraid of death, but because they had just begun to live the life they had fought so hard to deserve. But even in that heartbreak, they made a decision. Samantha's story would not end in fear. It would end in light. Together they wrote a second book called Still Here, a love letter to the ones who stayed, filled with essays, letters, and reflections not just about surviving, but about surrendering to what matters. They wrote side by side in the mornings, sipping coffee, wrapped in blankets, trading edits, and laughter like old songs only they remembered. The world rallied again, this time in softer ways, meals delivered, guest podcast speakers volunteering, clients writing testimonials that were more like poems. Emily took on more of the business, but never without Samantha's input. She refused to let her friend become a ghost before her time, and Samantha, knowing the clock was ticking, chose her moments like a poet chooses words, with meaning, care, and grace. They didn't talk about the end anymore. They talked about legacy, and every day they chose love. Samantha recorded voice messages for her mentees, handwritten letters for every woman who had ever sat in their healing circles, and a journal for Emily, marked, open on the hard days. She laughed more than she cried those days, not because it was easy, but because she had made peace with her story, and peace makes even the painful parts sacred. Emily threw her a celebration of presence party, instead of a farewell, inviting those who had been shaped by Samantha's words, her fight, her softness. There was music, dancing, tears, and stories. So many stories that night that even grief sat still, humbled by the joy in the room. And when Samantha stood to speak, her voice was soft but sure. You don't need to fear endings. You just need to love enough that your presence becomes someone else's beginning. And that night, even time bowed to her. As they approached their 40s, success no longer looked like it did in their 20s. There were fewer late nights, more boundaries, deeper friendships, and a growing understanding that legacy isn't what you build, it's who you become. Their story was turned into a documentary called Humbled, and it premiered at a local theater where former classmates, family, and mentees showed up with tissues and applause. Samantha's mum flew in for the event and wept through the film, whispering, I'm proud of you for the first time in a way that felt like a full circle. Emily stood with her arm around Samantha during the standing ovation, tears falling freely down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd and then at her friend. "We're really here," she whispered. And Samantha, with a cracked smile, replied, "And we're still standing." One rainy Sunday, they sat in their favorite cafe, journals open, hands warm around mugs of tea. As they wrote letters to their younger selves, Samantha wrote, "You will make mistakes, but they will not define you. Love will break you, then rebuild you." Emily wrote, "You will be left, but you will never be lost. And one day, you will find home in a friendship that chooses you daily." They didn't read the letters aloud. They didn't need to. They knew that what mattered most wasn't what they wrote, but that they had lived it, that they were still writing their story. In every act of grace, in every moment they showed up for each other. And as they watched the rain trace soft rivers down the window, they smiled, because healing had become their everyday language. The world kept moving, as it always does, but they no longer felt like they had to chase it. Their days were filled with purpose. Yes, but more importantly, they were filled with peace. Samantha painted now, something she had stopped doing in college because someone once told her it wasn't practical, and now her art hung in offices and therapy rooms across the country. Emily wrote poetry in the mornings, short verses that spoke to the ache and the beauty of being human, and her words traveled farther than she ever had. They still fought sometimes, still got annoyed, still took breaks, but love had become the foundation they returned to every time. And in their quiet little world, they created something sacred, not perfect, but whole. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't afraid of losing it, because they had built it from truth. And so, the girl who once shamed her friend for being broke became the woman who fought for her friend's life like it was her own. And the girl who once felt like a charity case became the woman who gave others the strength to stand tall in their own worth. They had become mirrors, lighthouses, bridges and homes, not because they had never fallen apart, but because they had chosen to come back together. And in doing so, they had left behind not just a story, but a path. A path for every woman who thought she was too broken, too bitter, too far gone. A path that whispered, "Come as you are, stay as long as you need. You are already enough." And in that truth, Samantha and Emily kept walking together. Later that week, they received a letter from a young woman named Casey, who had listened to every podcast episode, read their book twice, and followed their journey since she was 16. In her letter, she wrote, "You saved my life without knowing it. You made me believe broken girls can still be worthy of love." Samantha read the letter aloud through tears while Emily clutched her hand, both of them stunned into silence. They had never set out to save anyone. They'd only tried to survive their own storms with grace. But somehow, in doing so, they became a map for others. That night, they framed the letter and hung it in their office, next to a mirror and a sign that read, "You are enough, especially when you forget." And suddenly, their purpose wasn't a business plan anymore. It was a mission written in the hearts of every woman who no longer felt alone. They decided to host a 10-year celebration of their journey, not a gala or conference, but a retreat in the mountains, open only to those whose lives had been touched by their story. They called it Homecoming, and over 80 women flew in from around the world, some survivors of abuse, some entrepreneurs, some still healing, all carrying pieces of Samantha and Emily's legacy in their stories. The weekend was filled with yoga, storytelling, bonfires, and late-night vulnerability under the stars, where women whispered truths they'd never said out loud. On the last night, Emily and Samantha stood together and said, "We are not here because we figured it all out. We are here because we stayed when it got hard." The applause was soft but endless, not the kind that fades, but the kind that echoes in memory. And for the first time in years, Samantha felt something like peace settle in her bones. But life, in its quiet way, always offers one last test, not to break us, but to remind us how far we've come. A month after the retreat, Emily got a call that her father had passed in his sleep, a folded note found in his hand addressed to her. She read it in their office the next morning. Voice shaking but calm. "You taught me what love is. I am sorry for every moment I missed. You made me proud by becoming what I never had the courage to be." Samantha didn't speak. She just walked over and wrapped Emily in the kind of hug that says, "I know the weight. Let me hold some of it." They sat in silence for a long time, grief folding itself into the room like dust settling on light. And later that night, Emily whispered, "Forgiveness was worth it, even now." And Samantha replied, "Always is." And still, life moved forward, just differently. They adapted, reshaped their routines, added wellness retreats to their business model, began hosting slow living circles for high-achieving women secretly falling apart behind their polished smiles. Their audience grew, not just in numbers but in depth, drawn to their honesty about health, boundaries, resilience, and letting go of the myth that doing more meant being more. Samantha spoke often about her diagnosis, not with victimhood, but with vulnerability, calling it a divine interruption that reminded me to live, not perform. Emily shared her perspective as the friend turned caregiver turned co-pilot, reminding audiences that love is not always loud. It's often found in the background, steady and unnoticed. Together, they became more than mentors. They became mirrors reflecting back what healing looks like when you're not waiting for a finish line. Then one morning, as they were prepping for a podcast episode titled Grace in the Grind, Emily received a call of her own from her father's caregiver in Boston, telling her that his dementia had progressed rapidly, and he was asking for her by name for the first time in months. Emily hadn't spoken much about her family publicly, hadn't shared that her father had disowned her for pursuing a frivolous dream after college, or how he hadn't attended her graduation, or how he'd only reappeared after his diagnosis. Samantha listened quietly as Emily processed the call, her silence filled with 1,000 unspoken emotions: anger, love, hesitation, hope. "What if I go and he doesn't even remember what he did?" Emily asked. And Samantha, her voice soft but steady, said, "Then you remember, and you choose who you want to be in that room." Emily flew out 2 days later, her suitcase packed not just with clothes but with old letters, photos, and courage stitched into every folded shirt. Samantha stayed behind, managing their work, sending voice notes each night, reminding her, "You are brave for walking into a room you could have locked forever." When Emily arrived, her father was thinner, slower, a stranger with familiar eyes who looked at her and smiled like she was sunlight. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, until one night he broke down crying and said, "I was wrong. I missed your whole life." And Emily, through tears of her own, whispered, "I'm still living it, and you can still be part of it." It wasn't a perfect reunion, but it was redemptive. And in that Boston hospital room, another fracture quietly began to mend. The autumn air arrived like a soft warning, crisp leaves brushing across sidewalks and windowsills like whispers of change coming once again. Samantha had just finished her keynote speech at a women's leadership conference, where she'd been praised as the phoenix who rose from the ashes of her own mistakes. And though her smile was bright, It faded the second she stepped backstage. In her purse sat a sealed envelope she hadn't opened all day, sent from her doctor after a routine checkup she hadn't thought much of until now, until the weight of the unknown made her breath feel like borrowed time. Emily noticed the shift the moment Samantha walked into their shared office. Her eyes clouded, her posture slightly slumped, her laugh delayed by thought. "What's wrong?" Emily asked. Voice gentle but alert, and Samantha, for the first time in a long time, didn't answer right away. That night, they sat on the floor of Emily's apartment, surrounded by candles and quiet music, as Samantha finally unfolded the letter and read the words aloud, her voice trembling like a bridge straining under old weight. It wasn't cancer, but it was serious. An autoimmune disease, early stage, manageable with lifestyle changes and medication, but chronic and life-altering all the same. Emily listened without interruption, only nodding as her eyes filled with tears, not just for the diagnosis, but for how hard Samantha had fought to finally live fully, and how unfair it felt for life to interrupt that joy. "Why now?" Samantha whispered, clutching the paper, and Emily took her hand and replied, "Because maybe now you're strong enough to carry it without losing yourself." They didn't say much more that night, but they didn't need to. The silence was its own kind of sacred prayer. In the weeks that followed, Samantha's life changed again, not in the loud public way of a fall from grace, but in the quiet ways no one sees: fatigue that stole her mornings, brain fog that scattered her thoughts, aches that reminded her that control was an illusion. She had to cut back on speaking engagements, reduce their workload, delegate more, and for someone who had tied her worth to her productivity for so long, it felt like a slow unraveling of the woman she'd rebuilt. Emily became her anchor again, not as a crutch, but as a partner, learning about the disease, driving her to appointments, reminding her of her value in every word and action. Samantha struggled with guilt at first, afraid she was becoming a burden again, that their roles had reversed too completely. But Emily silenced that fear with a simple sentence one night: "Taking care of you doesn't drain me, it honors our journey." One humid Saturday morning, as the city hummed with life, and the scent of street vendors floated through open windows, a single phone call brought the past crashing back into their carefully rebuilt present. Samantha, still in her pajamas, answered the unknown number out of instinct, only to hear a voice she hadn't heard in years: Melissa, the old college friend who had once fanned the flames of her pride, calling as if no time had passed. "I saw you on TV," Melissa said with a silky tone laced with old envy and fake praise, "and I just had to reach out. Remember when we used to say you'd make it big without anyone's help?" The words scratched at old wounds Samantha thought had healed, tempting her ego with its former anthem of solo glory and independence. She listened politely, but her chest tightened with a pressure she hadn't felt in a long time. The pull to prove, to perform, to pretend she didn't owe her rise to anyone. She hung up with a forced smile, and eyes that immediately filled with shame, realizing just how seductive the past can be when it comes dressed in flattery. Emily walked in minutes later, with coffee and croissants, chatting about weekend plans and what books they'd add to their mentorship curriculum, unaware of the inner storm brewing behind Samantha's smile. As they sat by the kitchen island, Samantha hesitated before saying, "Melissa called," and just like that, Emily's face froze ever so slightly, like someone trying to brace against a memory too heavy to carry again. She remembered Melissa all too well, the instigator, the whisperer, the one who made Samantha feel like loyalty was a leash, not a gift. What did she want? Emily asked, trying to sound neutral, but failing to hide the tightness in her voice. And Samantha replied, she wanted to catch up and maybe collaborate. The air shifted between them, not with anger, but with unspoken dread, like they both knew this could become another test of what they'd rebuilt so painfully. "What did you say?" Emily asked, and Samantha whispered, "I didn't say no." For days, tension lingered between them, quiet and polite, wrapped in pleasantries and avoided conversations, but it sat like fog between their words. Samantha wasn't planning to abandon Emily. Not again, not now. But some old part of her craved the spotlight Melissa dangled, that golden what if, where she could shine solo and finally feel complete on her own. She hated that the thought tempted her, hated that it made her question whether her healing was real or just a habit she'd grown into. Meanwhile, Emily battled her own demons, replaying every moment from the past, where Samantha had chosen applause over her, wondering if people ever truly change or just learn to mask their patterns better. They went to work, they showed up for others, but in the quiet moments, walking to the car, brushing their teeth, scrolling through social media, they were distant, distracted by the sound of old footsteps approaching their door again. To mark this new phase of their journey, they hosted a private retreat for just themselves. No phones, no followers, no press, just two friends and the sea. They wrote letters to each other and read them aloud by the waves, voices cracking, eyes soft, forgiving each other again for all the old bruises that sometimes still ached. Emily's letter thanked Samantha for never letting the world harden her heart, and Samantha's letter thanked Emily for being her anchor when success felt like it might sweep her away. They buried the letters in a small glass jar beneath a tree by the shore, a secret monument to the mess they'd survived. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood hand in hand, not as equals in status or spotlight, but as equals in love, in loyalty, in growth. Months later, a major award nomination came in, not for Samantha or Emily individually, but for their mentorship program as a whole. And this time, they were invited on stage together. When they accepted the award, Emily spoke first, her voice clear and rooted. "This is for the girls who were never the loudest in the room but had the most to say." Samantha followed, tears glinting in her eyes. "And for the women who learned that you don't need to compete with your sister, you can rise with her." The audience stood, clapping not for personas, but for partnership, for the kind of friendship that dared to do the inner work and live out the healing it preached. As they left the stage, arms linked, they whispered the same thing at the same time: "We did this together." In the days that followed, interviews poured in, but they chose carefully, declining offers that felt performative, and instead opting for podcasts and platforms where they could be honest, without performance. They stopped chasing optics and started chasing impact, mentoring new female duos in business, teaching them not just how to build, but how to sustain when envy and ego threatened the foundation. Their curriculum included sessions like naming the silent wounds, building without competition, and when one of you shines brighter. They didn't promise perfection. They promised practice, patience, and tools for repair. And through it all, they remained mirrors for each other, reflecting truth, reminding each other of their worth, and holding space for every ugly feeling that still sometimes bubbled up. And so the temptation to compare returned, again and again, as it always does in a world that ranks and labels. But now they saw it for what it was, an invitation, not to compete, but to connect deeper. They didn't always get it right, but they always came back. They had learned the secret that few friendships ever survive long enough to uncover that loyalty isn't just standing beside someone in the light. It's staying even when their shadow falls on you. And in choosing each other again and again, they built something unshakable. Not fame, not fortune, but a fierce, holy kind of love that nothing could fracture.